Good evening, and thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Körber Foundation, and I'd like to thank the City of Bonn, and I'd like to thank all of those who have had the foresight and the imagination and the empathy to consider something which has been very close to my heart for very many years, for very strange and very personal reasons. If there is a word in the Exiles vocabulary that stands as a shining star, it is the word home. Home is where you come from, but it is also, I think, something you may lose. It's the exile's hole in the heart. But the longer and the further you live away from home, the harder it is to say exactly what home means. My own home country, South Africa, in the old days of apartheid, was a very strange location. A place where very many South Africans were never really, truly at home. The old South Africa was a kind of made-up place. It was a fiction, invented by the white-led nationalist government as a politically convenient deception. A deception of others, but also, of course, as a deception of themselves. Because the greater part of the inhabitants of my country at that time were not allowed to call themselves South Africans. That privilege was reserved for the few, for the very few. And it was granted to you only if you were white, but not black or brown or any other color in between. Even the definition of who constituted a white person was a very complicated procedure. After I left South Africa, and I'd been living for many years in faraway countries, someone once asked me, "Aren't you homesick?" And I had to say, yes, but you know, I was homesick before I left home. That was that kind of a country. And when I was young, I had the feeling sometimes that South Africa was not so much a country, but it was a novel created by an extremely mischievous and somewhat malicious creator with a very dark sense of humor. When I got older, I realized that, of course, we ourselves were the authors of that strange novel we once called South Africa. White people in South Africa, when I was growing up, were deliberately and willfully blind to all of those around them. It wasn't as if they didn't see them, it was as if other people, particularly people who were not white, were shadows, and they lived in some sort of strange, shadowy world which one never penetrated. And so I began when I was quite young to try and come to grips with the strangeness of being an exile in your own country, because that's what all of us were. You had your assigned place and you stayed in it, and the boundaries were drawn between different people of different ethnic groups, and that is where you lived and that is how you were known. South Africa in those days was a place of consistent, casual, and unending brutality. But it passed for much of the time, this brutality, as something that was perfectly normal. The same thing, I must tell you, may be said of the new South Africa today, in its much more democratic formulation. There are few places outside the worst of the war zones where so many people are killed with so little compunction. Well over 50 people a day. But what really tore at the heart of the country in which I lived was this obsession, this maniacal obsession with skin color, with ethnic background, with the purity of the blood. These are phrases which you will be familiar with. But I give you an example of the degree of absurdity combined with cruelty to which my country was much attached. When I was about 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old, I was crossing a railway bridge, and I got to the other side of the bridge. I was pushing my bicycle, and at the other side of the railway bridge stood the station master. And he said, "What color are you?" And I said, I'm white. He said, no, not anymore. You're black now, and I'll tell you why. He said, you see that other bridge? That bridge over there is for white people, but you crossed over the black bridge. And if you want to be white again, you must go back and cross over the proper bridge. So I did. And of course, I changed my color by doing what he told me to do. I crossed the bridge. And the point about my story is that this was not exceptional. This was perfectly normal. So the question for a writer in those days, and I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s, when I began to write, was how do you make sense about the people who make the rules, who run our country? And there were good writers who looked at the brutality of the country, people like Alan Paton and others. But very few people looked at the absurdity of the system which had been created in the country. And I began to read writers who somehow seemed to me to talk about the strangeness of the effects of power on those who have too much of it. And my models were writers like Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels and Voltaire, of course, and then exiles when I got a bit older, James Joyce and Vladimir Nabokov, and a great favorite, Joseph Roth. And my question to myself was, as somebody who was trying to write, how do I picture this perverse universe in which I find myself? And I began to realize gradually that even highly tragic countries under extremely repressive situations always have a thread of dark comedy. And of course, it makes one laugh sometimes. The trouble with highly repressive countries is that laughter can sometimes be very dangerous, but it is also liberating. And in the old days in South Africa, it was virtually compulsory for those who understood the system and entirely forbidden. So there were paradoxes one had to deal with. The old government, the old white nationalist government, if you looked at it face on, was quite clearly a gang of racist desperados whose barbarism was exceeded only by their stupidity. And they had a great deal of both. But although the regime was very powerful, it was also strangely sensitive. And it paid to writers the ultimate compliment of taking their books very seriously. I knew young poets who found more readers amongst the censors than they did in the general public. And our censors were formed together in what was called a publications board. It was one of those South African euphemisms. We had many of them. Apartheid was called separate development or parallel freedoms. And our censors banded together were called the Publications Board, but of course they did not make publications, they stopped them. Poems were banned. Advertisements were banned about anything that might be disturbing to the public morals. Advertisements for women's nylon stockings, films, plays, and of course, lots of people. You could be banned or placed under house arrest for what you said or wrote or believed. I think at one stage our list of banned books was rivaled only by the long list of banned books they kept in the Vatican. A title alone was enough to cause trouble. There was a famous example of Martin Buber's theological treatise called Between Man and Man, which was banned because it was suspected it was a gay homiletic treatise. But the curious thing was that these bans of people or books were taken very seriously. And it was, and I quote from the Act, it was an offense under the old South African law, to insult, disparage, or belittle our senses. So in a way, however strange it may seem, the old apartheid regime attempted to ban laughter as well. Back in the 1960s, I started a small magazine dedicated to publishing poems and stories by black and white and brown and other colored writers inside the country, and also writers from the rest of Africa. People like Leopold Senghor and others who were not known in the country. And this racially rich literature became very unpleasant to the apologists who put into effect the laws of apartheid. And of course, the usual surveillance began. One was followed, there were letters opening, your telephone was tapped. This was, again, entirely normal. But because I was white, the reaction of the authorities was far less unpleasant than it was had I been a black writer. And many of those left. We lost a generation of remarkable young black writers in the 1950s and 1960s, and we lost them to exile, to drink, to depression, and to homesickness, because many of them never came back. One of them was somebody I knew very slightly, a man called Nat Nakasa, who was a near contemporary of mine from my home city of Johannesburg. He lived in Soweto, and back in 1965, he fell to his death from a high window in New York where he was living. And I had the luck of commemorating his life and death in a play for music that I wrote for the Carnegie Hall. And they used to say that what killed Nat Nakasa was depression. But I think what killed him was homesickness. He was unable to operate outside of his own country, even though he was not permitted to operate inside his own country. And that's what I mean about this state of continual exile, which most people lived in. Joseph Roth, the writer I mentioned earlier, once wrote of returning soldiers from the First World War battlefields. He said, "A great homesickness emanates from them, a longing which drives them onward, the overwhelming memory of home." A little later in the 1970s, I had my next brush with the South African authorities when they banned a radio broadcast of my satirical poem, a long poem called Kobus Lachransi Marais, in which a disabled railwayman sits on a stool in a bar in Pretoria and complains about there not being too much apartheid, but there being too little. He blames everybody. He blames the English, he blames the Jews, he blames the government, he blames the world. When I wrote it, some people were quite amused, and the government immediately banned it. When this happened again, I became somewhat restless. And I was, I suppose, about 28 or 29, and I wanted to see something of what used to be called, in my country, the outside world, which was just about anywhere that wasn't South Africa. And so in 1975, I applied for a passport, thinking I might travel. I hoped I might travel. And that was a mistake, because in South Africa, a passport was not a right, it was a privilege. And my application for that passport was turned down. So I applied again, it was turned down again. It became a game. I remembered then that I'd had an Irish grandfather, so perhaps I could become Irish. And so I told them that that's what I would do if I wasn't given a passport, and they said, if you take foreign citizenship, we will remove your citizenship from you for good. However, they said, we will give you a passport on one condition. You may not come back. This was called an exit permit, but the exit was one way. So I took it. I took it and I set off to London on my South African passport, carrying my exit permit. And I've been traveling on an Irish passport ever since. I'm still without my South African citizenship, and I'm very grateful for my Irish citizenship. But there is something absolutely absurd about it. As anyone who has read any of my books will know, I am a South African. My family goes back many generations, and the older I get, the more South African I seem to become. But in London, in the 1970s, I was in for another surprise, because I found myself not very far from home. London was full of exiles like me. Oliver Tambo, who was in charge of the ANC while Mandela was still in jail, lived down the road, a modest and retiring, shy man. And the tragedy is that we lost him, because those who succeeded him are neither shy nor retiring nor modest. Several of these exiles who I knew came home after the release of Mandela, and many of them now run the country. I had my differences with the exiles in London because they became increasingly not non-racial, as once they had been, but more and more nationalistic. And having grown up in South Africa, in the acid bath of nationalism, extreme nationalism, you become allergic to all forms of it, white or black or any other color. It seems to me, and it does still, not an ideology. It is more like an illness. But we believed, all of us at that time in London in the 70s, that if ever change came to South Africa, one thing we would not do, we would not repeat what had happened for the last 50 or 60 years. We would not make race, ethnic difference, bloodlines, however you wish to define these ridiculous concepts, we would not make that the center of our lives, because it had ruined most of our lives. I'm afraid that that belief has turned out under the new dispensation to be somewhat overly optimistic. Anyway, while I lived in London, I published my first novel, a novel called A Separate Development, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a euphemism for apartheid. It meant that there was lots of separation and not much development. The book was immediately banned in South Africa. The book is about a boy who does not know what color he is. He doesn't know what color he's supposed to be. He's the sort of boy who crosses the wrong railway bridge and turns from white to black and then back again. So it's a satire. It's a gentle comedy. It made some people laugh, but not for long, because the banning was almost instantaneous. And so when you write a book which is your first novel, you only expect maybe 6 or 7 readers at the best of times. If you write a book which has an element of humor in it, you need to believe that whoever reads it will understand 1 or 2 of your jokes. The book went on to make a great success in America and in the UK, where nobody understood my jokes. And that was more painful almost than being banned. My next novel was called Kruger's Alp. And it was another satire, and it was based on the classic tale of Pilgrim's Progress. But it was not well received in South Africa. It was not immediately banned, but anybody found in possession of the book was warned solemnly by the security police that it was best to put it away. It was very awkward, because there I was in London, a writer of a sort, with a few readers, and 2 almostly unheard of books. And I began to travel, and it was my salvation, because the places to which I traveled were places that reminded me of home. I spent a good deal of time in Moscow, a good deal of time in the DDR, a lot of time in Zimbabwe, and in all of them, somehow or another, I thought, thank heavens, I understand where I am. In a way, I've been given a suitable education to appreciate how these things operate. Because most autocracies have an element of mimicry in them. They will use a similar vocabulary, similar forms of uniform, similar forms of the lies resemble each other. But what remains constant is the abuse of power, and at the same time, the absurdities that too much power produces. And therefore, for a writer, they are, in a sense, wonderful places to visit. The essence, as I say, of autocracy is mimicry. You know that marvelous remark by somebody that Lord Acton, I think it was, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The sting in that remark is not the second bit, it is the first. Power corrupts, however little. It changes the notion of those who govern about those who they are governing. By the later 1980s, the old South African regime began to realize that poets and painters and novelists were not about to start the revolution. They were not very good at it. And I found myself being commissioned by British and American papers to go to South Africa on special permission from the government for very short periods to write about my country in order to explain the complexities as apartheid appeared to be coming to an end. And that was a very strange situation because I would arrive on an Irish passport. I would be given a piece of paper which said, this man is a South African citizen traveling on an Irish passport and may reside in the country for 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It confused the people who met me, many of whom had not read anything I'd written, because I speak a number of the languages of the country. And I remember going to an all-white, all-Afrikaans-speaking community, and I spoke to somebody on the community, and somebody said to me, you know, for an Irishman, you speak very good Afrikaans. And I had tried to explain, but they would not hear, or could not hear what I was saying, so that when I went around the place, they sent somebody with me as an interpreter, not to check up on me, but because they said, it's better you understand what people are saying to you. So there I was, a South African, being accompanied by an Afrikaans speaker who literally translated every single thing that I was being told. And I would have to, as it were, pretend to be an Irishman who spoke very good Afrikaans. So your sense of identity, it was no good. I'd long since stopped trying to persuade people that I come from here. I am one of you. I come out of this country. In the 1990s, when Mandela had been released from jail and change was in the air, I tried to apply to regain my South African citizenship. But we now had a new government, and we now had new apparatchiks in Pretoria. And Mandela made a famous speech about freedom of speech. Wonderful speech. I'll quote just one line from it. He said, no single person, no body of opinion, no political or religious doctrine, no political party or government may claim to have a monopoly on the truth. Well, about that time, I wrote a piece in one of the London papers about my hometown, Johannesburg, and I remarked on its exuberance, its vitality, and its violence. This caused enormous offense to the apparatchiks who now ran things back in Pretoria. Anybody who knew the city, as I did, would have thought the comments I made entirely normal, but not those who govern these things. And I was loudly and often criticized as being unpatriotic and un-South African. You know, it was so like old times that I felt almost nostalgic. Then not long after Mandela was elected, one of my poems, the long poem that I had been seen to be banned years before, about the old railway shunter in Pretoria, was set to music in the New South Africa by one of the great singers in the country who put it onto his new CD. It was immediately banned again. And somebody said, what does it feel like to have been banned under the old regime and under the new regime? And again, my only feeling was, well, rather nostalgic. South Africa today has parted company with what had been the open expression by Mandela of his belief in the freedom of people to express their own opinions. There has just been passed, some months ago, a very unwieldy Act of Parliament called the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and the Hate Speech Bill. It's a very long and onerous title for a very silly law. Critics have pointed out that the new law condemns not hate speech, but speech that certain people find hateful. And that is a very different matter. As a result, you may be prosecuted in South Africa today for, and I quote, for mocking the concept or events or victims of hate crimes, even if no real person is depicted, or an image, or in the words that you write. South African journalists working inside the country have been verbally and physically assaulted by politicians who object to their gender, to their race, and to their reporting. And I know that these attacks are not confined to South Africa. They are familiar around the world. But the essential difference today is that these attacks often come from those people who were once opposed to the banning of books and once opposed the freedom to say what you thought and believed. And to misquote very slightly the poet Heine's fearful prophecy about book burners, it might be said that those who ban books, sooner or later, will also ban people. And South Africa is a classic example of this. The urge to control what people say and think goes hand in hand in South Africa today with a growing hatred of refugees and exiles. Many of them who have come to South Africa after the end of apartheid as sometimes economic migrants, but others are political exiles, and often no one can tell the difference. Zimbabweans, Rwandans, Kenyans, Malawians, and Congolese come and are now increasingly hunted out and hunted down. Over the past 10 years, my old university in Johannesburg has been counting the fatal costs of this kind of xenophobia. The numbers of those killed, those living in the country as exiles, now runs into the hundreds. Several thousand shops and businesses have been attacked, and people have been chased from their homes. And whole new political parties in the new South Africa have been set up with the sole purpose of expelling exiles and foreigners and strangers. In a final and further measure, the South African government has removed asylum status from political exiles. So if you take part in some political activity related to your home country, if you come from Rwanda, for instance, and you are actively opposed to the present government of Rwanda, and you say anything about it in public, you may be sent home. And home now is a word which strikes fear into those exiles who may be sheltering in South Africa, because often to go home means to go straight into jail or worse. So, despite the fact that when the present government was in exile, many, many, many of its most useful people were exiled in other parts of Africa and in other parts of Europe. Today, we put exile at the bottom of the list, and we do what we can to expel those who look to us, in a sense, for shelter. I'm often asked why I don't go back and live in South Africa. And of course, I yearn for home, and I think about it all the time. But I've still been unable to reclaim my citizenship, despite many attempts to do so. And it's no longer malicious. It's not that this is an intentional program on the part of the new government. It is now a question of inefficiency and corruption. But it comes to the same thing. The ANC government has now been in uninterrupted political power in South Africa for 30 years, just over 30 years. And the achievements are not very numerous. And the overall feeling in the country, for the great mass of people, is one very close to despair. And in a recent book, The Café de Mouvement Blues, I went back to South Africa and traveled around it, and we published the book, and again, it did my application for the return of my citizenship, I suspect, no good at all. Because today, race and ethnic background are again the measure of so much. So we have come, if you like, in an enormous circle, in that terrifying French proverb that the more things change, the more they stay the same. This indeed is the position we've come to. In the recent election in South Africa, we had our, which you might call our Marie Antoinette moment. Highly paid apparatchiks in the government would drive into dispossessed, very poor settlements in armor-plated imported limousines, roll down the windows and throw T-shirts into the crowds as they went past. It's the degree of absurdity which I never thought I would see after the end of apartheid. And so I wait. And I also see that in some way it's been useful to keep my distance, because exile offers a long view, and sometimes it offers a clear view of what can be a very complicated situation. And certainly South Africa and its history is very complicated. And I take comfort from a remark by that writer, Prince of Exiles, Vladimir Nabokov, who never returned to Russia, and he said, "I could not exchange the liberty of my exile for a vile and bad parody of my home." Thank you again for this chance to talk about something which is close to my heart. Thank you for those who have organized it. Thank you again to the Körber Foundation. And thank you for listening so patiently to what I've had to say.